Money, money, money. The federal government has more of it coming in thanks to a big increase in corporate tax receipts. The government is claiming a win for its crackdown on tax avoidance. But how much is due to the ATO's actions? And how much is because some companies are recording strong profits and are paying their dues? We'll talk to the Assistant Treasurer about that. The nation's agriculture ministers are meeting today and the likely arrival of bird flu is on the agenda, with poultry farmers concerned Australia's luck of staying free of the H5 flu won't last much longer. We'll check in with the National Farmers Federation. And the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is investigating 18 staff after the National Audit Office probed the Australian Passport Office and found a failure to meet ethical standards. Live from Parliament House, recognising Ngunnawal and other custodians of land around the capital, I'm Melissa Clarke and this is Afternoon Briefing. And with the US presidential election just days away, we'll hear from a leading Japanese authority on regional security about what the next US administration could mean for the Indo-Pacific and AUKUS. That's coming up soon. But first, a new report shows more than 1,200 companies paid no tax in the past financial year. An annual report from the Australian Taxation Office shows of the nearly 4,000 firms that lodged their returns, around 30% did not pay tax. But the overall amount of corporate tax being paid to the ATO has increased by 17%, which the government says is partly due to a crackdown on tax avoidance, as well as increasing profits by some companies. The Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, joined me a short time ago. Stephen Jones, thanks for joining us. We see that corporate tax receipts are up 17% under new figures the ATO have released. Is it a case of a tax avoidance crackdown working, or is it just that companies are doing particularly well and recording record profits and paying more tax?
Look, I think the good thing about this is we're seeing strong compliance. We put about $200 million into a tax compliance task force focusing on large businesses and multinationals, and I'm very pleased to see that it's reaping rewards. Australians want to ensure that whether you're a big business or a small business, you're paying your fair share. So pleased to see that in the numbers today, that we're getting strong revenue coming through that. Of course, it's what pays for Medicare, it's what pays for defence, it's what pays for all the services that Australians expect us to deliver for them.
How can we quantify, though, how much of that increased corporate tax revenue for the government is coming because of the tax crackdown to make sure that they're not profit shifting or avoiding? How much is due to that compared to just some companies in particular? We know a lot of our large mining companies have just had a really good year of sales.
Well, frankly, from a bottom line point of view, it doesn't matter that much. We want to ensure that as we continue to try and balance the budgets, delivering two strong budgets in our first two terms of office means that we can do more, and ensuring that we're getting every dollar that is owed through the taxation system is a key part of that strategy. Australians expect the Albanese government to do that. So bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of strong revenue coming through from those traditional sectors like resources and banking and financial services, but also knowing that we've got a strong compliance effort going on there as well to ensure that we're getting every dollar that is owed to the Australian people.
There's still something like 1,200 large companies not paying any tax at all. Is that acceptable? Can the crackdown on tax avoidance reach those companies that are not just, rightly perhaps for some of them, not recording paying tax this time of year due to losses or various reasons they might not, but likely some of them are still finding ways to move their profits elsewhere?
If it's avoidance that's going on, then it's not acceptable and we'll track it down. We're putting a lot of effort into ensuring that we're cracking down on tax avoidance, particularly in the area of multinational tax avoidance, working through multilateral organisations, through the OECD, but also here at home, ensuring that we're getting every dollar that is owed. Big priority for the government, huge priority for the government in that multinational area. And of course, as you say, there'll be some of those businesses who aren't paying tax because they're not making any money. They're breaking even, or they've made a huge capital investment, and any money they have made is being offset against the capital investments that they've made. So some of that is signs of healthy economic activity, particularly if there's been a big capital investment. We want that. It's going to drive productivity. But if it's avoidance, we're onto it.
Is it inevitable that there'll be some level of avoidance so long as Australia has a corporate tax rate of 30%? Is there any value in looking at a lower corporate tax rate in the hope that it might mean there is less accounting shuffling done and that could actually lead to a better outcome? Or are you convinced the 30% tax rate is the right one to remain at?
Look, a couple of things to say about that. It's 30%, that's the headline rate, but of course there are a whole range of offsets and allowances that are made, which means the actual rate, the underlying rate, is significantly less than that for most businesses. And as you've just pointed out, a whole heap of businesses, 1/3 of them in today's report, that aren't paying any corporate tax at all. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make is Australians expect our businesses, particularly our resources businesses, our banking businesses, and the multinational organisations, to be paying their fair share. And if we want to be able to continue to balance our budgets, we've got to ensure that whether you're an individual taxpayer or a corporate taxpayer, you're paying your fair share.
The Australian Financial Complaints Authority has been reporting of the number of complaints that it is dealing with, and it's dealing with an order of 900 complaints about scams every month. But it is reporting that does seem to be going down slightly. Why do you think that is?
Look, a sign of success, I've got to say. You would be aware, Melissa, that the government's put a big emphasis on reducing scams and preventing scams. Phase 1 involved our standing up a national anti-scam centre and pulling down fake investment websites. We're blocking about 1 million calls and messages a day, which is a significant uplift in our effort. More legislation coming into Parliament in a fortnight to uplift our effort here. So our strategy is working. There's no other country in the world that can say they're having the success that Australia is having, which is why people are now starting to talk about the Australian model for scam prevention. That's all great, but it doesn't mean we can rest on our laurels, because as soon as we do, the scammers come back, losses go up again, and that's not good enough.
Is this a sign that this is an area that really does need strong government intervention, that the financial institutions can't be relied upon to do the right thing to make sure that customers are as protected as they can be, and that a government has to step in here?
Yeah, look, 100%. The approach of our predecessors on this was that if you get scammed out of money, you're a mug and you're on your own, basically. It was a private problem, not a public problem. We think that's wrong, because scams have been industrialised, but they've also, if you don't get on top of it, people won't answer phone calls that they don't recognise. They won't respond to emails because they think it's a fraud. They won't respond to SMS messages because they think they're bogus. Whether you care about it from the social aspect, which I do, or you understand that it's actually undermining the rails of modern commerce, unless we get on top of it, you should have two strong motivations for wanting to do it. And that's the approach of the Albanese government. This is a public problem, not a private problem, and we've got to get on top of it. So we're really leaning, it is a priority for us. We are leaning into it. We want to ensure that we are the hardest country on earth for a criminal to make a buck through scams.
Well, it's interesting then to look at some of the other findings of the last financial year from the Financial Complaints Authority, because they also note that complaints about financial institutions dealing with hardship has gone up, and it also is quite critical of a number of insurance companies, saying they're not taking enough of a resolution mindset, that it's still too adversarial and not doing enough to resolve complaints that people have about those services. Does that then suggest that maybe this is requiring more government intervention with banks and insurers to put more pressure on them to resolve complaints earlier in the process?
Can I say in the area of insurance, when somebody's lost their property because there's been a fire or a flood or some other tragedy, the last thing they need is to have to be involved in a brawl and a dragged out fight with their insurance company. Prompt payment, prompt resolution, prompt clarification of rights is what is needed. And it's exactly why I got Dr. Daniel Molino to chair the recent inquiry into insurance claims handling, particularly arising out of the New South Wales and Queensland floods recently. He's done a great job, a series of recommendations to both government and industry. We're going through them now, an excellent report, and you'll see us implementing a lot of those recommendations as soon as possible. But, like, the insurance industry doesn't have to wait. The message to them is get better. We want to ensure that you're looking after your customers and that they're not adding insult to injury after they've had their properties wiped out through a flood.
And look, before we let you go, I do want to ask you about the issue that has taken up much time in Canberra this week of politicians accepting flight upgrades or access to the chairman's lounge from Qantas. Given the risk of the perception of a conflict that this creates, do we need our politicians, yourself included, to perhaps rethink whether or not they should be accepting flight upgrades or a chairman's lounge? Is the declaration process not enough to allay public concern that it might be influencing policy decisions?
Look, I don't think it does. Can I first start by saying I don't think it does influence policy decisions. I've read all the stuff and I've watched all the stuff over the last week, and there's a lot of strong words that have been said about it. I'm certain that it doesn't influence policy decisions. Should politicians be banned from upgrades or Qantas? Frankly, I don't care one way or the other. It's not a big deal to me, but I think Australians are actually focused on, is Medicare working properly? How's cost of living? Is my job secure? Am I getting a pay rise? Frankly, they're the issues. I know it's fascinating in Canberra, and I know there's a lot of tit for tat stuff going on here, but I think Australians are really in a different place.
I know you say that you don't believe that it creates any influence on policy decisions, but it can create the perception that there could be. And we know that that's important and when it comes to transparency and accountability. So given the perception issue, and given that we have had things like the decision to not grant Qatar extra, slots coming into major airports, which, at the time you said was to help keep Qantas viable and competitive, would there not be some value in reassessing that issue of perception that might remain even if the policy influence isn't affected?
I think we've got to continually assess these things to ensure that we are keeping pace with community expectations. I actually don't think it makes a difference. Both Qantas and Virgin have the same sorts of lounges. I think Rex does as well. I don't think it's exceptional. When I've been into any of them, you'll see sports people, you'll see business people. Yes, you'll see politicians. It's, so there's... frankly, I don't think it changes the way people make a decision either way. All of the airlines have these facilities available to them, so it's not like people are making a pro-Qantas or an anti-Qantas decision depending on which door they walk through. I just don't think that happens. But I do accept your point, frankly, around perceptions. I'm not sure where it ends, but I do accept your point that, that we've got to ensure that we're continually reviewing behaviours and arrangements to keep pace with community norms.
All right, something I think we'll keep assessing and perhaps perpetually keep assessing. Stephen Jones, thanks very much.
Good to be with you.
The federal court has found One Nation leader Pauline Hanson racially vilified Green Senator Mehreen Faruqi in a tweet in September 2022. Senator Hanson told Senator Faruqi to piss off back to Pakistan in a tweet. The tweet followed a social media post by Senator Faruqi, who commented she couldn't mourn the death of Queen Elizabeth II because she was the leader of a racist empire. Senator Hanson has been ordered to delete the tweet and pay Senator Faruqi's costs for the proceedings. In response, Senator Hanson posted on social media that she is disappointed by the judgment and will appeal it. Outside court, Ms Faruqi labelled the judgment as groundbreaking.
Today's ruling tells us that telling someone to go back to where they came from is a strong form of racism. And it is also an affirmation for migrants that people of colour do not have to be grateful or to keep quiet. and I will be speaking out more loudly and more strongly than ever before.
In recent years, the Passport Office has been notorious for the lengthy waits to get a new passport. And while that has been improved, it turns out there were other issues in the Australian Passport Office at that time. The National Audit Office has examined how the Passport Office managed procurement, and it's found that it fell short of ethical standards, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is now investigating 18 people. Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedget joins me here in the studio. Stephen, thanks for being here. And look, the National Audit Office has been looking at the procurement that was undertaken by the Passport Office. What did it find?
Look, it found that procurement simply wasn't up to scratch. Now, this isn't what's happening right now. This is basically what happened from about 2019 to 2023. So this is a little bit in the immediate past, but not so long ago. That's right, yeah. What it's found basically is that there was a habit of contracts being rolled over. So typically when you've got a procurement or a contract that you want to hand over as the federal government because you need a service, in the case of passports, maybe you need someone to do the printing or someone to do the work on the security, the technology involved in passports. You meant to open it up to tender. So you meant to say to all the companies that might have an interest, here you go, would you like this contract? What's happened, according to the Audit Office, is that most of the time when it comes to the Passport Office, that didn't happen. Contracts weren't necessarily put out to open tender. Most often they were rolled over. When they were put out to open tender, the processes behind that were substandard. Typically, it seems like contracts are basically handed to the companies that the Passport Office already knew and was accustomed to working with. And in some instances, about 16 instances identified by the Audit Office, conflicts of interest were not declared by the officials who were responsible for making those decisions.
It sounds like there were some cosy relationships or perhaps just a bit of laxity in how these processes were done. That's not a good sign for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which, as part of its broader role, as the department looks at how other countries manage these sorts of issues to try and prevent corruption or poor behaviour at a governance level. So this can't be good for DFAT's reputation.
No, it's not good for the Passport Office reputation or for DFAT's reputation either. Now, the Passport Office historically does sit a little bit to the side of DFAT. It is within the agency, but it is a somewhat discrete organisation in some ways. But nonetheless, this is uncomfortable reading for the Secretary and for senior leaders inside the department. And what it also highlights is the fact that the office and the department were concerned enough by some of these practices that they've actually now investigated, or in the process of potentially investigating, 18 people. Now, we don't know exactly who these people are. We know that they include officials, former officials, and some contractors. So we don't have a firm idea exactly where they sit in the system. But obviously, if these ethical lapses and problems were serious enough to justify that investigation, it gives you a sense of what's going on.
Look, the ANAO looks pretty closely at the details of how these things arrange, and it can seem a bit opaque sometimes, talking about procurement and best use of taxpayer-funded money, taxpayers' money. Can you give us an example of what the ANAO, an example of where the ANAO has pointed to a process that just hasn't met the ethical standards that it expects of public servants?
Look, this one doesn't directly touch on procurement or contracts, but it's one that the ANAO has still highlighted, and it is, on the face of it, a pretty extraordinary little vignette. This happened back in 2022 when officials from the Passport Office were trying to scope out a conference venue for a conference on passports, essentially. Now, they took 2 trips to Port Douglas, a very pleasant, as you might know,
It's not a bad place to hold a conference.
It's a very, very, very pleasant part of North Queensland, a resort town north of Cairns. They took 2 trips there to scope out a resort or resorts at a cost of some $30,000 to Australian taxpayers. Not cheap, but then somewhat extraordinarily perhaps, after they had made that rather expensive couple of trips to Port Douglas, they decided that they would actually have to hold the conference in Canberra instead. And that brought more expense for the taxpayer, because breaking the agreement that they had with that Port Douglas resort in terms of the refund fees and the cancellation fees, the deposit that they put down cost taxpayers another $104,000. So that's around $140,000 or so, with nothing to show for it at the end. Now, obviously, the audit office has decided, I think rightly, that this isn't an appropriate use of taxpayer money, and it says the department agreed that things were not done appropriately and that this wasn't an appropriate expenditure.
I think it would be very hard to find a justification that could see that process be regarded as a proper one or a best use of taxpayers' money. Look, Stephen, just while we've got you, I do just want to ask you one last brief question. You've been looking at what's happening in Papua New Guinea, and the Bank of China is very close to being able to open its first branch in the Pacific in Port Moresby, but that seems to have caused a few security concerns amongst the security community here in Australia and other parts of the region. Can you tell us why they're a bit worried about this development?
A couple of things that people are watching very closely. The first thing that's worth noting is that if Bank of China does get the final green light to open an actual banking branch in Port Moresby, that would be a first. It would be the first time the Bank of China, which has offices here in Australia, has managed to get a full foothold in the Pacific. What are the concerns? Well, there are a couple. The first one is that the Bank of China's processes when it comes to things like the laws that it keeps to try and stop money laundering, for example, or the flow of money to terror organisations, are simply much more opaque. They don't play by the same rules that Western or US banks do, which means that officials in Australia are just much less confident about exactly what might happen. The second thing worth noting is that this comes, probably coincidentally, about 6 months or so before PNG is about to open its first casino at a place called Parga Hill in central Port Moresby. Now, this is a sprawling sort of development that's being proposed. There are already concerns about just how Papua New Guinea's regulatory systems, which are pretty weak, might deal with the prospect of a casino, which, as we know, are typically hubs for things like money laundering. You throw a new bank that plays by different rules into the mix, and some officials and analysts are worried you've got an absolute recipe for crime. But it's still a little while off. We'll have to wait and see how it plays out.
I think it's one we'll watch closely. Stephen Jedgetts, thank you very much. And look, we'll move on to some of the other stories around Canberra this week. And one of them has been farmers and conservationists coming together to call for more action to try to eradicate red fire ants. It's a pest species which has a really painful bite that's become established in southeast Queensland. Now, a Senate inquiry made a series of recommendations about how to tackle the invasive species, but a range of stakeholders have been unhappy with the federal government's response this week. They're wanting to see more funding and quicker assessments of progress than what the federal government has suggested it will do. Now, the CEO of the National Farmers Federation, Tony Ma, joined me a short time ago. Tony Ma, thanks for joining us. We have had this week the government release its response to the Senate inquiry into managing red fire ants. And the NFF isn't entirely happy with how the government has responded. It has said that it's noted or accepted in principle all of the Senate inquiry's recommendations. So where do you see a shortfall here?
Yeah, look, I think it's really in the recognition of how much of an impact these fire ants are going to have on the community, and very simply the amount of funding that's directed towards controlling what is going to be an incredibly invasive pest. It's already in place in parts of Australia, and our real concern is that it gets away. We're sort of throwing a little bit of money at it, but if we don't throw the adequate resources at it, it will continue to grow and just spread right across the country. So that's our concern. I think what we're saying is there's a real opportunity to control fire ants right now, and if we give it a decent amount of effort, we can get on top of it rather than waiting and missing an opportunity. And once we miss that opportunity, we'll probably never get a chance to control it.
So we currently have the federal government and Queensland government sort of matching funding from each other, and it all together comes to about $1 billion or $1.2 billion to try and both contain a ring around the current outbreak in southeast Queensland and then entirely eradicate it. Is it the quantum of funding that's the problem? Is it the manpower, or is it both of those things?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of both. It's really just, I think, people in rural and regional areas understand how invasive and how destructive this pest can be. So we really don't want to leave any stone unturned in terms of what we throw at this pest, because what we've seen with other invasive pests is if we don't control them, then they become endemic. And, we wish in hindsight that we had have thrown everything, including the kitchen sink, at this pest. So, what we're really stressing to government is don't miss the opportunity to capture and control these red imported fire ants, because they will be incredibly destructive. So we're really just keeping the government's feet to the fire and saying let's not miss this chance.
I guess that's a difficult one as well, because these sorts of biosecurity issues often require cooperation with federal and state governments, but also other states that aren't necessarily directly affected at the moment, but they're meant to be invested in biosecurity for the whole nation as well. So you've really got to get that message through to a lot of people, don't you?
You absolutely do, and it does come down to a local government, a state government and a federal government level, and we know that there's sometimes challenges with cooperation across those three levels of government. So it really will require comprehensive leadership from the federal government. And I think, our response to some of the things that the government has noted or agreed in principle to, we'd really like them to get behind it and say, we recognise the importance of this and we are going to do everything in our power to control it. So, that's what we want. The funding has been good, but we just can't miss this opportunity to control these red imported fire ants.
And look, for anyone who might not have had any experience of red fire ants or might not be aware of just how damaging they can be, can you just give us a quick insight into how it affects, not just the agriculture sector, but daily lives for many people who live in communities where there are red fire ants?
Yes, and luckily enough, I haven't been bitten by one either, so I'm hoping that continues. But they're an incredibly painful bite, and these things can just spread right across parkland, across farmland. They can have a negative impact, a harmful effect on animals, but also humans. And again, once they get endemic, then they will be everywhere, and it will impact certainly farmers in rural and regional communities, but in its worst case, parks and gardens and things where people are, having recreation and enjoying themselves. And if these fire ants get out, it'll be an incredibly invasive and painful experience for parts of the community that are unfortunate enough to come in contact with them.
Look, I want to move to another issue that's certainly on the minds of some in the agriculture sector, particularly poultry farmers who are really worried that the high pathogenicity H5 avian flu that spread to just about every part of the world except Australia might be on the cusp of arriving here, given it's now spring and there's a lot of migratory birds arriving in the country. What are poultry farmers having to do to prepare for this likely arrival?
Just consolidate their biosecurity plans is the main thing that they can do and are doing. We've seen the incursion of some pests and disease in Australia, and we have been incredibly lucky. Collectively, the government, state governments, community has done quite well to keep Australia relatively pest and disease free, and we need to maintain that awareness. So right now, chicken producers are consolidating, improving, refining their biosecurity plans to make sure that they've got the appropriate measures in place, because if this virus does come in, like it has around the world, it'll devastate the chicken industry and the community. And it's such a widely consumed product here in Australia, up to 50 kilos per year. The average Australian consumes of chicken protein, so it'll have a huge effect if we don't continue to ramp up and improve and maintain our biosecurity standards.
I think we got a bit of a sense of what it could be like a couple of months ago when we had a different strain of avian flu affect egg supplies and have to see some quite strict biosecurity measures and culling be done to try and prevent its spread. That did seem to be successful as a containment measure. Was that perhaps a harbinger of what might need to be done if we do get this virus in, or is it a case of once it arrives we have to find mitigating ways to live with it?
Look, it really depends on the incursion on a case-by-case basis, but you're absolutely right. We've seen a glimpse of what is required and what can happen to food supplies neutralise if a disease or a pest comes in. And yes, we've seen it in eggs. We hope we don't see it in chicken meat, but we've seen again, scares around foot and mouth disease, lumpy skin disease, these pests that we've been lucky enough to date to keep out of Australia. So we've just got to be, on our toes and on our game and make sure that we dust off all of our biosecurity plans and measures and control measures that we've got in place to prevent this disease coming to Australia.
And is there anything consumers can do at this point? We know the farmers are often on the front line with these issues, seeing their livestock, but with things like bird flu, is there a role for the public here too in being alert?
I think there's a role for the public more broadly, not so much in chicken flu, but more broadly just to have an awareness and make sure that they support farmers, continue to support Australian grown, Australian produced food and fibre, which we think of course is the best in the world. But farmers are really on the job and on the front foot in terms of making sure that their farms are protected. So if anyone goes anywhere near a farm, respect the biosecurity requirements that all the farmers have got in place, and that will go a long way towards helping reduce any impact of any of these pests or diseases.
All right, well, let's hope for the best and plan for the worst. Tony Ma, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.
The looming US presidential election has leaders across the Indo-Pacific considering what a change in administration will mean for the region. Donald Trump returning to the White House will inevitably raise concerns about his level of commitment to AUKUS. And a Kamala Harris victory could see American foreign policy focus more on Europe than on the Indo-Pacific. Satoru Mori is a professor of contemporary international studies at Keio University, a leading research university in Tokyo. He spoke to Afternoon Briefing's Greg Jennett about relations between Australia, the US and Japan, and about regional security earlier this week.
Professor Satoru Mori, welcome to Afternoon Briefing. There's so much to discuss about Australia-Japan relationships and Indo-Pacific developments at present. Why don't we start discussing China's conduct around Taiwan lately? There have been record large military exercises conducted in the air and sea domain around Taiwan, I think also including Japan's exclusive economic zone of late. How provocative do you view those exercises?
Quite provocative, I would say. China's coercion towards Taiwan has been multifaceted. So we've seen military coercion and also economic coercion, and they have been interfering in Taiwan domestic politics as well. So this has been a growing concern for Japan as well. But with regard to a sort of a full-scale invasion by China on Taiwan, the expert community in Japan basically now sees that this is not going to happen anytime soon, but the risks will get higher when we enter probably in the 2030s. And right now, Japan's trying to respond by trying to deter that kind of Chinese invasion of Taiwan by cooperating with the United States and also countries like Australia.
Yes, and if anything, those cooperative arrangements are only strengthening and expanding. What's a natural end point, do you think, for Royal Australian Air Force, Royal Australian Navy, when it comes to operations with Japanese defence forces, visits to ports and other activities in that area?
Yes, I think the military training and exercises between Japan, not only between Japan and Australia, but a sort of a trilateral military training and exercises between US, Japan and Australia is becoming much more frequent. And I think it's going to get much more sophisticated as time passes by. And I think that we have a shared concern about the risks of an armed conflict in the Western Pacific. And so there are going to be more robust, I would say, defense cooperation between the three countries.
What do you mean by more sophisticated? Paint a picture for us about what the full integration of those military partnerships looks like in a couple of years from now.
Yes, it's going to be about integrating Navy, Air Force, as you mentioned, and also cyberspace, and possibly electromagnetic as well. And so in the modern era, what they call all-domain operation is becoming to the front, and three militaries are actually looking to sort of integrate the command and control of the various services. And in that sense, I think the command and control of all the domains will become a sophisticated endeavour on the part of the three militaries.
Is it possible, based on recent encounters that Australian forces have had with the PLA, that Australian forces bear the brunt of coercive conduct by the PLA more than Japanese or American forces? That has been the recent pattern of behaviour with jets and the dropping of chaff and running past helicopters and the like. Do you acknowledge that there are greater risks of Australia being targeted under those scenarios?
In the South China Sea, possibly yes, but it's not only Australia that is facing this kind of risk. I think Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, and also the United States is also trying to collectively deal with that kind of risk. So yes, I think Australia faces this kind of risk, but it's not Australia alone. We're together. In this.
We're seeing only enhanced cooperation bilaterally and trilaterally, as we said, between Australia, the US and Japan. That came to a new level off the coast of New South Wales last week when Japanese observers took part in AUKUS Pillar 2 activities. What's the next phase of development in that particular relationship?
I think there has been this new development in Japan. This past May, we passed this legislation on security clearance, and this is going to open up new opportunities for international joint research and development. And we hope that Japan will get involved in some of the individual working groups in the AUKUS Pillar 2 projects. So, for example, undersea, unmanned undersea vehicles would be one area where Japan might be interested. But in the future, we might see more opportunities to engage in these various workshops on an a la carte basis.
So what are the impediments to that? There are security clearances. You've acknowledged that.
Yes.
What else might be a barrier to full cooperation?
Potentially, maybe information security is an issue that the Japanese government has to take care of. It's a big homework, and we've been trying to institute sort of an information security architecture that would provide confidence in any potential partner that we may engage, not only in terms of high technology, but also in terms of sensitive data sharing. And this is going to be a very big and important issue that Japan is going to have to overcome. And I think they're working full steam to resolve this issue.
I see. Yeah. Now, I can't let you go because we are a week out, almost less than a week now, out from a very significant electoral event in the United States of America. If Donald Trump's second presidency is established, what are your expectations about his willingness or desire to enter into negotiations with President Xi over Taiwan?
That's the probably the biggest question that we also have. We'll actually really have to see how he will handle the Taiwan issue, because we've been seeing his statements saying that Taiwan has to spend more on defense. All the while, he also says that Taiwan has stolen semiconductor industry from the United States. So we do see this sort of a conflicting signal coming up from Mr. Trump. And for the time being, I think his focus will be on the economic side. He has declared that he will impose 60% of tariffs on all imports from China, and also 10% across the board from all countries' imports. And so these kind of economic issues, I think, will likely be the focus of his policy towards China. But in subsequent phases, we have to see how he's going to deal with Taiwan.
Well, let's not polish off that crystal ball until we get there. Let's wait and see what the actual result is from the US. Professor Satoru Mori, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
As we do every Friday, it's time to pick apart the week that was with some of the Parliamentary Press Gallery's best and brightest. So joining me today, I have Ellen Ransley from The Nightly. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Mel.
Jack Quayle from The Australian joining us too. Thank you, Jack. and the ABC's own digital reporter, Courtney Gould. Thank you for joining the bench here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So lots to get through. Obviously, the biggest story in Canberra this week has been about the level of communication between Anthony Albanese and Alan Joyce around flight upgrades. Now, Ellen, for all the talk this week, all the communication we've had, are we clear about just what sort of communication there was between Anthony Albanese and Alan Joyce?
I think there's still a bit of unknown about this. So Anthony Albanese himself hasn't come out in front of the media since Tuesday. Everything we know has been from his office or has been reported on background. But his office have come out and said he never called Alan Joyce, further understood on background that he's not contacted Alan Joyce or took him aside at any occasion and solicited him for these upgrades, which is what the initial allegations were. But I think there's still some questions around, well, was there a conversation at another point? Did Alan Joyce call him? Did they WhatsApp? Did they signal? Or, there was some really careful language I think the Prime Minister's office put out this week. And then, you've had him kind of speak to Ben Fordham on 2GB, who then, read out this exchange he had with Albanese where he denied, certain methods of communication. But I think, yes, there's still more answers. There's more questions to answer, I think, definitely.
And certainly it seems to have everyone rushing to check their own records. Courtney, we've seen other MPs in Parliament updating their register. It certainly got everyone a little bit worried, I think. Is that fair?
It certainly has. And you've had Bridget McKenzie out there. She's been probably one of the most vocal critics of Anthony Albanese this week. She's launched her own audit because she came out and she was very emphatic. She said, no, I haven't received an upgrade. But on her register, there was an upgrade. So she's written to the CEOs of Rex, Virgin and Qantas asking for logs so she can properly disclose her travel details, which I'm sure the CEOs of the airlines are really enjoying that task. So yeah, she came out this morning. She was like, look, I was a bit emphatic. Oops, sorry. But it hasn't really stopped her. She's still criticising it. And we've seen other MPs now update their registers too.
I think it's really interesting, Jack. This all started with Joe Aston's book. And there's sort of one line in there where he's made this reference that Anthony Albanese liaised directly with Alan Joyce. And as Ellen has said, we haven't really got to the bottom of quite what that means. It could be that staffers were speaking to staffers from respective offices. It could have been a bunch of other things. Does the fact that this is quite unclear tell us a little bit about the nature of these soft perks, I guess you might describe them as? Yeah. Is it a fairly common process for MPs to get these little gratuities?
I think absolutely it is. I mean, you don't have to look very far into any MP's register of interest to see a huge amount that they often declare, and then they're also often surrendering a lot more as well. So yes, I mean, I think Qantas is just one example. They've got an incredibly powerful lobbying machine, but from all angles, politicians are receiving, and their staff are receiving gifts, favours regularly.
Yeah, I think this just really has all gone to the nature of soft power and corporate lobbying, and it's probably raised a lot of questions with voters who maybe weren't so attuned to the fact that our politicians do receive a lot of gifts and donations from some pretty big corporate players, and there have been some real questions raised around, well, is there a quid pro quo? So we've obviously had some of the flights in question that involve Anthony Albanese allegedly occurred while he was Transport Minister. There's questions around Peter Dutton accepting a flight from Gina Rinehart, and, the Labor is pushing back, well, does Miss Rinehart expect anything in exchange for this $40,000 charter flight that Peter Dutton took? So I think, there's been questions for a while now around the influence of, like, for example, sports betting companies when we're talking about the need for gambling reform. I think this has just really shown, put a spotlight on, that soft power and corporate lobbying.
Certainly, Peter Dutton has come under some scrutiny, Courtney, because of those flights that he had requested from Gina Rinehart. What do we know about those? Do we have much information about that?
Yes, those flights were declared on his register of interest some time ago. I think it was 2022 from memory. He was asked earlier this week, hey, what's the go with this flight? And he pretty much shut it down. Yesterday he had to come out and be like, oh, I did take a flight with Gina and my office did organise it, but hey, I saved the taxpayer $40,000 because the government was playing games and wouldn't give me an RAAF flight. So it's kind of...
It's different, but it's similar.
Yeah.
It's kind of in the same basket. It definitely does come back to those questions of is there a quid pro quo? Jack, what should we read into this? I mean, it's very easy to say, look, as the government has, and as Peter Dutton has also done, said, look at our policy positions. We've taken, Anthony Albanese has said, I've taken policy decisions that haven't suited Qantas. Peter Dutton has said, look, it doesn't affect our industry policy. We support the mining sector. That's not because they give us a flight. It's because we believe in it. But it can also be a really amorphous thing, the idea of influence, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be, I made this policy decision because you gave me a free flight. That idea of a conflict or how it might persuade someone can be a little harder to detect as well.
Yeah, and I think voters will see repeated examples of this and think, I haven't been given that voice, and where there is regularly so much contact between the corporate sector, lobbyists, and politicians. That relationship isn't available to everyday voters.
And what political perception do you think that might leave? Because I know if I got an upgrade to a business class or a first class flight, I'd probably be talking about it for the next 20 years because it'd be pretty extraordinary in my life. But for MPs, it seems to be a pretty normal course of proceedings for the day. I can't imagine, Jack, that when people come to think of their image of politicians, this necessarily leaves them with a great image.
And I think it's clear like how widespread this has become with Albanese, because he's actually accepting upgrades on personal travel. It's not even at the point, I guess, where it's just in his line of work. I think a lot of voters actually, to an extent, understand that if you're working, there is that is more, I guess, reasonable. But in personal travel, that's something completely different. As a private citizen, that you would enjoy the trappings, I guess, of the office beyond the office itself. I think that really grates with the electorate.
Yeah.
Well, especially when you're going on flights, as we all are now that travel's back open and travel is booming, and we're all walking past that pointy nose of the plane having a little look through the curtains. It really is a physical representation of what we voters have and politicians might have. There's a curtain that literally closes you off from that front section. So it is just a physical manifestation of what voters might already think about politicians.
And I think there's a real question that voters are probably asking about politicians. Should they be accepting any perks, whatever that might look like, whether it's flight upgrades, the chairman's lounge, anything that might be seen, just having the perception of potentially influencing their decisions.
We could probably go down a whole other rabbit hole of sporting tickets and tickets to grand finals, but maybe we'll save that for later on in the year, because we do have a couple of other topics. One of the other big issues this week has been the National Anti-Corruption Commission's decision not to investigate the robo-debt referrals that it got. Now, the inspector of the National Anti-Corruption Commission handed down a report looking into that decision this week. Ellen, what did it find?
Yeah, it was pretty significant. So the inspector found that Commissioner Paul Brereton, who had disclosed a conflict of interest with one of the, if we can go back a few steps, there were 6 individuals referred to the National Anti-Corruption Commission by the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. The NAC decided not to investigate. Paul Brereton declared a conflict of interest with one of those people, but the inspector found this week that he did not properly remove himself or did not properly deal with that conflict of interest. So, for example, he presided over meetings where, the media release was discussed and all that kind of thing. So it came to that he had engaged in misconduct. So now the National Anti-Corruption Commission will bring in an eminent person to review that decision and go back to the drawing board and see if there is cause to investigate those 6 people through the corruption watchdog.
And Jack, the investigator was, I think, fairly clear that this was a failing of judgment on the behalf of Paul Brereton. Do you think this damages the reputation of the NAC in such early days of its operations?
Well, that's the exact thing, right? It is such early days in the operation of the NAC. I mean, this is, probably, I guess, in a lot of ways set up as a litmus test for the the NAC, and we're 12 months in, it hasn't actually had a single successful finding yet, and so I think there is a lot of disquiet amongst those advocates that push so hard for its creation. Why hasn't it actually resulted in any findings of corruption yet?
Yeah, Courtney, this was something that a lot of the Teal independents had pushed really hard to get the NAC to come into existence, and they've certainly been watching its operations closely. Have we heard what their view is of the NAC in light of this finding?
Yeah, some of them have been pretty critical about Paul Brereton and for him not stepping aside and properly dealing with his conflict of interest here. There are a number of them that said it's untenable for him to stay, and so that's a lot of a few integrity experts have also come out and said he should be rethinking his position on the NAC now because of this. It is a pretty damning finding.
And Senator David Pocock wants the statutory review of the NAC to be brought forward in light of this as well. I mean, the NAC, from its inception, there has been some criticism about the fact that the hearings have never been public. They've all been held behind doors.
Yeah, because that's something that's different from, say, the New South Wales ICAC, where there are public hearings, but that wasn't something they thought they could get agreement in Parliament on, and Labor worked with the coalition on. But that's changed the nature of how the NAC works.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, there's not been any success, but we don't know what's happened behind closed doors. We don't know, who's been referred or necessarily what hasn't been investigated, for example.
So how do you think the calls for Paul Brereton to reconsider his position will go? Do you have any sense of how that might play out?
Look, I think there's some pressure from the Greens and the Teals, but I mean, Peter Dutton backed him in, the Albanese government. They haven't said a lot this week, but they've said that the statutory oversight that, was embedded in the NAC is working. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe a review, maybe something would come out of that, but otherwise I don't see it happening.
I think what would be interesting, though, is these 6 referrals were included part of the sealed section of the Debt Royal Commission's findings. I know Attorney General Mark Dreyfus said this week that they're considering the release of that. So will we see that as a result of this? More questions to come.
There's still other avenues as well that those referrals from the Debt Royal Commission can be investigated. So the AFP is still investigating the sealed section. It's not entirely finished yet. So there are still other avenues.
It certainly does seem that robo-debt is going to be a story that will stay with us for a lot longer, and I'm sure for many of the victims, they'll be pleased to see that it is still being pursued. Let's move on now to the US presidential election, because this is something that has captivated the world. We will have a result in a couple of days, we hope. Maybe it'll take longer depending on how the votes go, but it's something that is really going to capture the attention of politicians when they're back in Canberra next week for Parliament sitting. Do you think it's going to be a little bit distracting, Ellen, knowing how much of a political watchers all the MPs are?
I think so. I mean, the Senate estimates next week as well, and I think Foreign Minister Penny Wong is due up in the hot seat as we start to see these results come in. So that should be interesting.
She'll be multi-screening like the rest of us.
I think so. I think, it's a pretty consequential election. There's been a lot of talk about, the US-Australia relationship is deeper than who's in the lodge or who's in the White House. But Donald Trump and Kamala Harris represent 2 very different ideas, and they have 2 very different foreign policy objectives. And I mean, there's still questions to be answered about what Donald Trump would do with AUKUS and with the Quad, and he's a lot more of a protectionist than Kamala Harris is. So I think there is probably a bit of quiet hope that Kamala Harris is successful, but yes, I anticipate that there will be a lot of distracted MPs and senators when those results start coming in.
Courtney, we can expect that the federal government has been preparing for either eventuality, and we know that AUKUS is one of the issues that they're really concerned about. But is there really much the Australian government can do at this stage? Is it a matter of waiting, or does that groundwork that they try and do in advance, is that important?
I would say it is important. You've seen Kevin Rudd put in a lot of groundwork with both camps in recent months, days, and whatnot. But I just guess it is a wait and see. Like, what can we do? What can the Australian government do but anticipate the results, follow along with live blogs, and
watch closely.
Stay up into the night.
Yeah.
If you're going to be there for a Senate sleepover, good watching.
There's been a lot of preparation in the public service, though, for either outcome. I mean, the government wants to be here to hit the ground running, so to speak. Treasury, the Reserve Bank, a host of other economic institutions have modelled the implications of both a Harris or Trump administration. So there is, certainly been work done behind the scenes to ensure that the government is prepared when the outcome is known.
Ellen, your paper has been reporting that Kevin Rudd, whilst he has been busy making contact with both camps, he's also been out promoting his book this week. Is it the right time for him to be on the book sales tour, or is there potentially some benefit to Australia of having Kevin Rudd, the China scholar, spruik his knowledge?
I think the timing is maybe a little bit curious. I think the government probably would prefer him to be in Washington, DC, and preparing for potential changing of the guard. But the coalition is demanding the government front up an answer. I haven't seen any responses from the government on that just yet, but we are following that very closely.
Jack, do you think Kevin Rudd is, a very high-profile figure in Washington, and his knowledge of China is one of his assets in that role? Do you think that there is the chance that there's some benefit to this if other deep thinkers in Washington see Kevin Rudd as a source of knowledge or someone that might be useful to contribute to a future administration on China? I
certainly think there is, actually. Yeah, I mean, he's known in policy circles in Washington as being the expert on China. So I think actually it is quite favourable. I mean, it's probably going to be only a couple of days if he's taken it off at most. I don't really see it having a massive impact. And also, I'm not sure who he's going to get an audience with at the moment, given that so many people will be consumed by the presidential election.
I think that's a very fair call, Courtney. I think we can assume Kamala Harris and Donald Trump probably have more important issues in the final days of their campaigns than meeting the Australian ambassador, as much as Australia might like to think we're a high priority.
Mel. I can't believe you don't think that.
Sorry, am I talking down the country? I didn't mean to.
Yeah. I certainly know that I don't think I'd be allowed to take a couple of days off before the election. But each to their own.
Each to their own. Look, before we wrap up, we do have Senate estimates sitting next week. As you mentioned, Ellen, it's a good time to scrutinise public servants, talk about funding. I just want to get from each of you perhaps something that you're looking forward to seeing in Senate estimates. Ellen, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first. Anything we should be keeping an eye out for?
I always enjoy watching the defence estimates. It's the first time that the new CDF will front up since the changing of the guard. So I think the Defence Force has a real problem with recruitment and retention. We know that AUKUS, there are questions around the AUKUS timeline, especially if Donald Trump becomes president. So I think that will be a really interesting one to watch.
Jack, how about you?
Department of Finance will be up. There's been a lot of questions about the preferential treatment of Qantas from government accounts, MPs, staffers. A lot of public service regularly fly with Qantas. I figure that's going to be subject of intense
I think that will be getting lots of eyeballs on it. And Courtney, briefly, what are you going to look out for?
Look, Jack just stole mine.
He always does that.
I'll say I always look forward to seeing Penny Wong in action in Senate estimates, and that eyebrow, when she raises it, you're in trouble.
I think that is a very good observation, that one. We do know she knows how to work the estimates process, that's for sure. So, Ellen, Jack and Courtney, thank you very much for running through the week with us.
Thank you.
Look, it is going to be a busy week in Parliament next week, as well as Senate estimates in the upper house. In the lower house, the government is going to be trying to push through a number of parts of legislation, because after next week, there's really only a fortnight of sittings left. So for a government that's looking at heading to an election in the early part of 2025, these last few weeks of Parliament are really crucial to try and achieve any last policy wins it wants to get before it asks voters to give it another chance to stay in for another term. So stay with us here on ABC News Channel. That's it for Afternoon Briefing, but we have more news coming up. Joe O'Brien will have all the latest headlines for you at the top of the hour. Thanks for being with us.